We're recording. Okay, with respect to timing, we will have about 30 minutes of dialogue and discussion from our presenters, and then we will turn it over to Q&A from attendees, as we rarely have the opportunity to engage with such knowledgeable professionals one-on-one. For that Q&A session, we'll be using the raise your hand function, or you can type your questions into the chat, or you can type privately to Steve, Deborah, or myself, and we'll be happy to get to those and curate that. The American Chamber of Commerce in Cambodia has been at the forefront of trying to support our members' interests and help the Cambodian government respond to these tariffs, in particular by way of private meetings and working groups, of which we've had many. The Chamber's mission is to support our members, and as a part of that value proposition, having pertinent and timely events such as this. The new year has brought with it a regime that has upended global trade norms, and now we all have to react to this new world of uncertainty. So to avoid stealing any of their thunder, I'll stop there, and I'm excited to introduce our guest speakers today. Steve Okun is Head of External Affairs for the American Association of the Indo-Pacific and founder and CEO of APAC Advisors. He advises companies on geopolitical risk, trade policy, and public affairs, drawing on over 25 years of experience across government and business, including roles at KKR, UPS, and in the Clinton administration. A former chairman of AmCham Singapore and trusted media voice, he regularly speaks on US-Asia relations and the global business landscape. And Deborah Elms is Head of Trade Policy at the Hinrich Foundation and a globally recognized expert in international economics, trade, negotiations, and economic development. She previously founded the Asian Trade Center and held senior roles at NTU and the Temasek Foundation Center for Trade and Negotiations. With a PhD in political science, she works closely with governments and companies to shape effective trade policies and agreements across Asia. Deborah and Steve, thank you both for being with us this morning. And at this point, Steve, I'll turn the floor over to you. Thank you.
Great, Devin, thanks so much for having us. I've just figured out, Devin, I now think together we've got 40% of ASEAN covered in terms of doing these events. Devin and I, of course, we've done them in Singapore. We've been up in KL. We did one virtually together in Vietnam, and now one virtually for Cambodia. And individually, I think I'm almost positive we have all of ASEAN covered, but we're at 40% now. And it's as you said, Devin, extraordinarily timely. The way Deb and I do these is I'll go first and I'll take the geopolitics, and then Deb will follow up on the geoeconomics, both of which Cambodia is unfortunately at the forefront of feeling the brunt of the changes that we're seeing in both geopolitics and geoeconomics, driven in part by China and certainly more so now by President Trump and his administration. And just one point that Devin mentioned, as he said, I'm Head of External Affairs for the American Association of the Indo-Pacific. So this is a group of AmChams and corporates that is put into place because when you start to think about the debate that's ongoing that we're going to talk about today, both from a geopolitical and a geoeconomic perspective, the debate's either driven out of the countries, like by AmCham Cambodia, AmCham Singapore, AmCham Malaysia, or it's driven out of DC, either from the US Chamber or the US ASEAN Business Council, the US China Business Council. So you've got a country lens, you've got a DC lens, but you don't have that regional lens. And that's something that we think that we can do, bringing the AmChams together. So we have 8 or 9 AmCham members, and then we have corporate members like UPS, who is representing us up in APAC today. And Deb will talk a little bit about what's going to be happening there in terms of the trade negotiations. So my focus, as Devin mentioned, on geopolitics, and the main message I give to businesses, investors, governments in Asia is that we are in a different world now, and we're not going back. And that geopolitical world that really started to get built post World War II is coming to an end, if it hasn't ended already. And what we need to know in Asia is in part why it ended, and in part what the administration in Washington is doing. Part of why the reason ended, and you have to go back, 10, 15 years at least to Beijing to get the start of this, is that the focus of the United States was that it was going to the United States, its partners and allies in the G8, with Japan and Korea and the EU, and the Americans and the Brits, and the Aussies, that we were going to welcome China into the global rules-based trading system. We were going to engage with them, to bring them into the WTO and other organizations, and that we would accommodate their rise over time. And because what we predicted would happen is that as China became engaged in the global trading system, it would become more like us, and it would adapt to where we are. And we were wrong. That's not what China did. And China maybe was going to do that and changed, or was never going to do that. Regardless, it hasn't. And what we're seeing now is a reaction to indigenous innovation, which China came up with in 2006, and Made in China 2025, which China came up with in 2015, and then a few years ago, dual circulation. So all of these things happening in China, we've seen a reaction to it from the West, led by the United States, but not just by the United States. And what this led to was that we were going to look at China different from a geopolitical perspective, and we were going to use economic tools differently than we had in the past. And I'm going to leave that part to Deb. But where it has changed under the Trump administration, as opposed to where it was under the Obama administration, to the Trump administration, somewhat in Trump 1.0, and in certainly the Biden administration, is that we continued to work with partners and allies as we addressed China's unfair trade practices. And so you saw this with President Obama creating the TPP. You saw this with President Biden with the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. You saw this with some degree to President Trump in the first term as well, with the Quad, more on a national security and a strategic perspective. What is different now, and it is very clear under the America First Trade agenda, and this is what Cambodia needs to understand, is that we, the United States, no longer look at working with partners and allies in this competition with China. Everything is now through a bilateral lens. And it's this shift from globalization to mercantilism, back to mercantilism, is that you look at every country one-on-one. And so the question is not, how does a country fit within your overall geopolitical strategy from an economic and trade and national security perspective? It is purely on what is the economic relationship. And of course, with Cambodia, if you look at it purely from a bilateral trade perspective, the U.S. has a trade imbalance. And that's all that this administration focuses on. Very different from where we have been in a bipartisan way. So that's a huge difference that Cambodia needs to understand. Everything is looked at in the bilateral lens. Now, the second thing that Cambodia needs to watch, as does all of the other countries in Southeast Asia, all over the world, but Southeast Asia, is what is going to happen with U.S.-China competition. And there are three different paths that we can foresee U.S.-China relations going down. One path is something called, you could say it's the grand bargain. And this is the view that, President Trump is all about art of the deal, and President Trump is all about signing big agreements, and that his goal with all of the things that he's doing to China right now is to get a grand bargain, and that there will then be some type of economic relationship normalizing between the U.S. and China. So that's one path. That, of course, is a path that would be, from I think, a Cambodian situation, the best path to go down. It's not the most likely path, but it's a path. The second path is the path that we're on right now. And this is the small yard, high fence, as the Biden administration described it. And this is where the United States will work with China and says, we understand that we have to have economic integration. We understand that trade and investment is important between the two of us, but we are also in a severe competition with China, and that if China, we have to restrict China's rise. And so we're going to restrict China's rise by prohibiting it from getting the most important technologies of the 21st century, those related to semiconductors and artificial intelligence, and biopharma and the like. And so we're going to have this small yard that's going to get a little bit bigger. This started under the Trump administration, continued under the Biden administration, and then it could continue further under Trump 2.0 as we have a medium yard with a high fence. So we'll still have trade and investment going back and forth, but we're going to restrict it. The third possibility is decoupling, and that is where the United States says we are in an existential battle with China for the 21st century. If we continue down the path that we are on, we are going to have to rely on China for everything that is important to us, critical minerals, rare earths, pharmaceuticals, and that we're going to stop this now, and we're going to have a strategic decoupling. And what this might mean, and I'm now going to turn it over to Deb and tie these two things together, what this might mean for Cambodia and other countries is that the U.S. is not only going to decouple the U.S. from China, it is going to require other countries, if they want to trade with the U.S., to decouple from China. And so, as Prime Minister Lee from Singapore, the former Prime Minister, would say, United States, don't make us choose between the U.S. and China. We want to be able to trade and engage and invest with both. The United States may be making countries to have that choice forced upon them. And that will be a very difficult choice and very difficult to enforce. So that leads us now, the geopolitics leads us to the geoeconomics. One, tariffs. How is the U.S. using them? What's happening with Cambodia? What's next? And then from U.S.-China, what is Cambodia facing if it wants to lower those tariffs? So Deb, I'll tee you up with those two questions.
Great, thanks very much. I'm happy to be here. Okay, so let me just say a couple of key points on trade in particular. So the first point that I would like to make is, although Steve sounded like the Trump administration was fairly coherent in its aims and its objectives, I think on the trade front in particular, there is no coherent strategy. And so one thing you have to recognize up front is that the Trump administration is pursuing multiple objectives, many of which are incompatible with each other. So they're in conflict with each other. And which one is dominant depends on which minute of the day are you asking Donald Trump which one is important. And so I think to start off with, those folks who are looking for coherence are going to be deeply disappointed, because this is not an administration that is coherent. And trade policy in particular is run by Trump himself. He has his own longstanding beliefs on what trade should look like and how it should be conducted. And he does not have a team around him really who he trusts, I think, to implement his vision, whatever that vision is, in the moment in which he has that vision. So that's made this very difficult and very complicated for outsiders, because you're trying to figure out where we headed, and we're not really headed in the same general direction. Hence the confusion and the back and the forth. And they just had a piece yesterday out of the Washington Post, which I like, because it pointed out that somewhere between 50 to 55 different tariff initiatives have been proposed, implemented, rescinded, implemented again, implemented multiple times in the same sectors, rescinded multiple times. So, it has really been an exhausting period of time for trade and economic policy out of the US. And as a result of that, and I'm sure you're all on this call understanding this, for recipients of US trade policy, which is the globe, that feels very unsettling and very whiplash inducing, because it's this policy one day and it's that policy another day, and you're kind of caught in those crosshairs, and it's creating real obstacles for companies who are trying to figure out where do they go from here. And of course, it's creating real challenges for governments. So let me just spend a second, will be slightly longer than a second, apologies, 50 policies takes a long time to unravel, but let me just give you sort of broad outline of tariffs first, and then I'll talk about what is some of the government responses that we're seeing elsewhere to these policies. And I would say up front, as much as perhaps AmCham Cambodia is a sort of different bunch than other groupings of businesses. You know, we really do have to pay attention, unfortunately, to what Trump is up to because it has global implications. Even if you're not directly trading with the United States, there ends up being implications for the way in which we create supply chains, raw materials, parts, components, final goods, services delivery, digital trade, like all of that is now up in the air in a way that it hadn't been in January. So that's sort of, again, why we're not sleeping well and yeah, why this has been an exhausting last 100 and whatever it is, 10 days, something like that. So let me talk about tariffs briefly, just to give you a bit more context, because if you're not doing this every day, and even if you are, it's hard to keep track. I would say there are sort of 4 general buckets of trade and of tariffs on trade that matter. And they're driven by a couple of Trump's, although he doesn't have a strategy, he has some strong tendencies. One of them is he only cares about trade and goods. So he's not interested so far in trade and services, intellectual property rights. He's not that interested in investment, honestly. It's all about trade and goods. And he believes, as he has said repeatedly, that tariffs are the most beautiful word in the English language. He thinks there is no problem for which a tariff cannot fix that problem, okay? So when you look at his early stage of what he has done, he's focused on trade first, and he's used tariffs as a weapon to deal with what he thinks is unfair trade practices, as shown by bilateral trade in goods vis-a-vis the United States. That is not unexpected. That is what Trump that's his own personal views and has not changed in decades. Okay, so that's where we're at. So day one, he started right away with the tariff application, and he went after Canada, Mexico, and China on day one over fentanyl issues and imposed tariffs on all 3 countries. The crucial, I won't talk so much about Canada, Mexico, unless we have questions. I'm going to focus much more on what's happening in Asia. The tariff on China for fentanyl started at 10%, was rapidly escalated to 20%. That 20% tariff for fentanyl is still in place. So any trade from China into the United States on every good gets a 20% fentanyl application. Okay, that still remains, even after this last weekend's change again in policy, still have 20% fentanyl. Then we have a sort of second bucket of category of tariffs that matter. They may matter a little bit less in Cambodia, which is like maybe good news for you, I don't know. But the sort of second effort on tariffs is on sector-specific tariffs. So we saw this on steel, aluminum, and all stuff made with steel, aluminum, and metals. Those are now at 25%. Those have not changed. So globally, 25%, everything steel, everything aluminum, and everything made with that, whether it's frying pans, tennis rackets, table furniture, doesn't matter. All metal products, steel and aluminum, get 25% into the United States. Hasn't changed. They then came with the next sector-specific tariff, which is autos and auto parts, now also at 25% globally. There is a long line of things in the queue of sector-specific tariffs that are ahead. They may be at 25%. They might not be. They could be at 50. They could be at 3. We have no idea. But the point is we've got sector-specific tariffs covering a larger and larger set of products. Now that matters maybe a little bit less for Cambodia, given your export basket at the moment to the US, but it's still worth keeping an eye on, because the more that stuff gets put into these national security Section 232 sector-specific tariffs, the harder those are to remove. So those were the second action by the Trump administration. The third action is the one that I'm sure you are all most aware of. Starting on April 2nd, April 3rd here in Asia, we had Liberation Day, the tariff Lollapalooza, in which Trump went out in the Rose Garden, as you may famously recall, with his charts to show what is the reciprocal tariff. And as a result of the formula, and let me just remind everyone again, you can't say this enough, it's not a judgment call. There's no sense of like, you're a good partner, you're a bad partner, you're very discriminatory towards the US, you're not discriminatory, we have security ties, we don't have security ties. There's no judgment attached to this. It was straight up, how much do you export to the United States? How much do you import from the United States? Take whatever number that is, divide it in half, that's your reciprocal tariff level. So Cambodia got hit really hard because, no surprise, it exports a ton, and many of the businesses on this call are the reason why it exports so much to the United States, because businesses have seen that opportunity. They make stuff in Cambodia, they send it to the United States, but there's not a lot of Cambodians. So even if they were wildly wealthy, there's not enough Cambodians to import from the US to offset that. So the result of that was Cambodia got hammered on the reciprocal tariff day with 49% tariffs. If you were below 10, just to sort of, and everybody else in your space got hit hard too. So all of the textile and garment producers especially got hit hard. So you're at 49, 46 for Vietnam, in the 40s again for Bangladesh, for Sri Lanka, even Myanmar got 44%, so think about that one, 44% for a country in a civil war with an earthquake. So this was not a judgment call. It was just straight up, this is the formula you got. If you were under 10, if you had no trade deficit at all in goods, which is Singapore's problem, you got hit with a 10% thanks for playing the game tariff. Okay, so the way in which these tariffs were rolled out is the 10% globally was applied and is still in application for everybody. We are all paying 10%. But because the markets then went bonkers, there was a pause on anything above 10%. So the discussions now in this 90-day window through July, just after July 4th, is over the additional bit beyond the 10. So in Cambodia's case, the 39% reciprocal tariff. That's where the discussions are. Not about the 10. The 10 seems to be accepted, which I find bizarre, and please keep fighting against this, as a floor. Somehow everybody has to pay 10% and we're supposed to accept that as fine. That is not fine. So please keep arguing about 10% is not fine. And then let me just mention briefly, the last bit of the tariff discussion was the China-specific tariff. So that, as I mentioned, they started with the fentanyl 10-10. Then they got hit with a 34% tariff on reciprocal tariff day. The Chinese, which had been fairly muted actually in their response to the first two tariff increases, said, fine, if you want to play this reciprocal game, we'll reciprocate 34% on US goods, which made Trump mad. So then he said 85%. The Chinese said, fine, 85%. Then Trump got really mad and said 125, to which the Chinese said, great, we'll go to 125 as well. We're not, after that, it's stupid. We're not going to go any higher than that, but whatever. If you want to do this game, we'll do this game. So suddenly, out of nowhere, really, we went from relatively high levels of tariffs anyways between the US and China, dating back to his first administration through the Biden administration, to unbelievably high tariffs, 125% on US goods to China and 145% or more on Chinese goods to the US. That happened within a matter of days. Big mess. So over the weekend, we had a climb down, at least a temporary climb down from this, in which both sides agreed that they would lower their reciprocal rates to 10% each way.
Did Deb just freeze on us, Devin?
Builds on top, especially of the fentanyl tariffs for Chinese products. These market are at 10, unless there's all sorts of other things. It comes and goes. I'm sorry. My internet connection in the office is, what can you do? So that's where we're at with China. So China currently also paused for 90 days while they try to work out some kind of agreement. It's a little unclear what that will look like. But all of that trade turbulence has created, of course, huge opportunities and huge challenges for companies. Do we invest? Do we put in orders? Do we ship orders quickly? If there's a shipment quickly out of here, will it arrive in the US in time to get lower tariffs? Will we hit higher tariffs by the time the shipment arrives in the US, et cetera? This has really been a challenge for companies. And as a result, governments are enthusiastically trying to negotiate with the Trump administration. But that's been very challenging, in part because the Trump administration, unless you have Donald Trump in front of you, it's unclear what it is that they want. And so you, foreign government, show up to negotiate with the US government, and they're kind of clueless about what they actually want you to do. It's not really, again, it's not really about your non-tariff barriers. It's not about your tariff levels. It's not about really anything that you've done. It's just about, whatever is the unfairness at the moment and the level that seems appropriate. So that's very hard as a negotiating partner. And the result of that, and I'll wrap this up, at least this opening bit, just in a second. The result of that has been this sort of, effort to try to get into Washington to deal with this. And efforts to talk to US officials when they're in the region. And so today, for example, in Korea is the APEC trade ministers meetings. Nobody's going to focus on what APEC does, I'm sad to say, for APEC, but everyone will be focused, I think, on two things today. One is what has happened in all of these sideline meetings with Jameson Greer, USTR, where he's got a whole series of meetings coming up today. So the series of meetings does not include Japan. The Japanese decided they're not interested in the deal that's on the table at the moment, and their solution to this problem was, we just won't go. We will send very junior people, and so, too bad we can't have the bilaterals as intended. So that's a sort of, that's a signal right there. If you know Japan, that's like, yeah. Other countries are, however, having those negotiations, and so trying to figure out what that policy package looks like. But it's not just about what the U.S. wants. There's also a lot of initiatives going on in the region, and including at Korea this week, to think about other ways of having economic integration. And so because of the challenges attached to the US and trade with the US, governments and companies are starting to look at alternatives. And one of them, which fingers crossed we'll get an announcement sometime today, is the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, joining in some way with the European Union. Now, they will not be joining the same agreement because that's going to be too difficult and too long, but they will be potentially having a lot more cooperation. Now, that doesn't necessarily matter to Cambodia. Cambodia is not a CPTPP member, but the point is that we're looking at new ways of integration outside of the US that is not done in the past. And so I think that is something to watch. What happens with CPTPP, what happens with RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, for which Cambodia is a member. How do you leverage the In Asia for Asia platform for economic growth and development? ASEAN has been extremely busy in doing more efforts to beef up its existing commitments within ASEAN and with others. Those of you on this call who are not looking or have never looked at the ASEAN Australia, New Zealand FTA should do so, because they just upgraded ANSFTA. And frankly, for firms that want to do inter-ASEAN trade, ANSFTA is far better than anything ASEAN's done on its own. So, ANSFTA is a way to increase certainty for firms and lower risks. And at a time like now, you need that. So I'm going to say that my last bit in this opening, and I apologize for going so long, but that's what happens when 50 pieces of change have happened in 100 days. You have to think in ways that you didn't have to think before. In the past, it was just easy. The US, huge, lucrative consumer market, simple, that's where you went because that made a lot of sense. But unfortunately, if that is not the case, it's going to be too difficult, too challenging. If the compliance costs, which are through the roof, if those continue to increase, then you may have to start thinking creatively about how do we do whatever we're doing in a different way, with different markets, with different suppliers, with different opportunities ahead. Or you could get caught where you're really struggling to work with the US markets and you don't have an alternative. And let me just point out the last bit. Your competitors in other markets are doing this. So if you just sit there and wait for the US to calm down, which, God only knows when that will be, then you're missing an opportunity as well to think about how to pivot where your competitors are really scrambling and they're pushing as the gas pedal if they can. Where else can we sell what we're doing? Where else can we source from? How else can we continue to have employment in our domestic factories, et cetera? So, this is an unsettled time in a way that no one anticipated. Of course, we all knew that Trump 2 was going to be challenging, but I don't think anyone thought it was going to be this level of challenging and this fast. And I think that is really why we end up with so many people on calls like this who are, struggling to figure out, where do I go from here? So let me stop. I apologize for being so long, but sometimes there's too much to be short. You used to be able to condense stuff down to a 3-minute opening, something or other, but now there's just too much happening to do 3 minutes. So anyway, thank you very much.
And I'll put 3 things in the chat while Deb was talking. One, Deb and I are starting to do these YouTube short videos, although I couldn't figure out how to put it down to the short section. But the link is there. In this one, we talk about what's the difference between trade and goods and trade and services. And as Deb puts it, trade and goods is when you can drop it on your toe, then it's a good. And if you can't drop it on your toe, it's a service. So we have that there, and we'll put up a bunch more. And then just if you want to ask questions, the 4 buckets of tariffs that Deb walked through: universal, reciprocal, Section 232, and China. Certainly, the reciprocal is something that Cambodia will be greatly focused on right now. And then, as Deb mentioned, the meetings up in Korea, the American Association of the Indo-Pacific put out a statement. One of the things that we want to focus on is that we want the United States to look at the non-tariff barriers, because in many ways, it's not the tariffs that Cambodia has on incoming products. It's the non-tariff barriers behind the border issues that we face, and that we'd love to get addressed as the United States goes through this exercise. So we do talk a bit about the non-tariff barriers, and we'd love to get Cambodia's input into this project. With that, Devin, over to you. Questions, however you want to run them. We'll take anything.
Yep, absolutely. Well, thank you both for setting the table that we're all going to be working with here. So first off, if anybody has questions, there's the raise your hand function, so we can call on you or put it in the chat. One quick question, if anybody's going to spend time typing in the chat, from either Deb or Steve, is there an adult in the room in DC that's kind of trying to deal with this or get us into some sort of normal path, or is this just everybody's throwing their hands up at this point?
Okay, I better answer first because I know what Deb's going to say. So let me go first. We're not sure yet. And certainly it appeared, if you wanted to see who is driving Liberation Day, right? That chart was done by, as we understood it, the Secretary of Commerce, Lutnick. So Secretary Lutnick. And then ideologically, this was being driven by Peter Navarro. Death to China, the author of Death to China, who truly is, a Trump whisperer, if not outright shouting about how tariffs can solve all of our problems. So that is certainly who was in the driver's seat, it appeared, during in the lead up to and on Liberation Day. But what you saw, who is it that went to Switzerland to negotiate with the Chinese? It was neither Lutnick nor Navarro or anywhere near Switzerland. It was Jameson Greer, who is a professional when it comes to trade, who's an acolyte, not of Navarro, but of Robert Lighthizer, who was the USTR in the first administration of Donald Trump, who is certainly, you could call, a hardliner when it comes to tariffs and trade, but is nowhere near that Navarro world. And then you also had Secretary Bessent, who's unlike, he is a true Wall Street. He's not the Wall Street of Lutnick, but he's more of the finance side of Wall Street. And it was Bessent and it was Greer who were in Switzerland. And so if it is now Bessent and Greer who are driving this, you are going to get a more coherent policy. It's still Donald Trump's trade policy, and which has conflicts, but I think you're going to see more. It's not going to be Liberation Day levels. Now, where it's going to be between Liberation Day and Trump 1.0, we don't know, but it'll be closer to Trump 1.0 than to Liberation Day. Deb, half the time you're shaking your head no, and half the time you're shaking your head yes. So where do we agree and disagree?
I think it's important to recognize how unusual Trump 2 has been. Typically, the US, for example, would not have rolled out a policy like Liberation Day without a lot of internal alignment ahead of time, right? You would have circulated this between the deputies and the principals. You would have said, Agriculture Department, please weigh in. What do you think? Defense Department, what do you think? That's not happening. That is not happening. And so this is being driven largely by a sort of a seat of the pants discussion, I think, by a very small number of people. And that is, again, compounding challenges, because documents are being drafted by people who don't have actually the expertise to draft them. You see so many of these executive orders. I mean, the lawyers are going bonkers because the executive orders, they make no sense. They're internally inconsistent. They're inconsistent between executive orders. And so now they're having to issue executive orders to clean up the mess from previous executive orders. And at the front edge of this, especially, is the poor folks from Customs and Border Protection, who are the CBP people, are dying because they're getting news of a new policy, potentially like hours before it's actually meant to be implemented. And then they have to figure out, well, what is that? How do we implement it? How do we tell our firms what is the policy and how do we make sure that that's right? And even CBP is now issuing corrections to previous corrections to previous corrections. So this is just being managed in ways that we did not expect, and we certainly haven't seen from the US in the past. Is that going to get better? You would like to think so, right? You would like to think that this level of chaos and turmoil is going to calm down. But because this is Trump's signature initiative, and because he turns to it whenever this is at least my assessment, he turns to trade tariffs whenever he feels like he needs to make a show, I suspect that we will have this continuing level of focus on trade tariffs, threats, removal, change policy, do it again for as long as he stays in office. And he's not going to be constrained by the people around him. Now, he could be constrained, and this is, I know Steve's big argument, he's constrained by markets, but he's not constrained by markets pretty easily, right? He seems remarkably, in my view, relaxed about harming folks in the real economy. So, if you don't get $30, you can have two. Walmart just said that they're going to be raising prices because Walmart's very China exposed. That is a big deal. And I do think that even though we've had a slight pause with the Chinese, the damage to the US economy is significant, and it doesn't just suddenly turn back on the way it was. We are going to have disrupted supplies in stores now. They will stay disrupted. People miss the orders for things like back to school season. They are not sure whether they should put in orders now for Halloween or for Christmas. If you put them in now, then what happens if the tariffs go up? What happens if the tariffs go down? So the uncertainty continues to bedevil firms trying to grapple with this. And I don't know that we're going to have a more consistent group of policymakers surrounding the president ahead. So it's not like you can envision more adults in the room ahead than we have right now. Where that goes from here, I don't know.
So, and I think the way to think about to think about this is that, and I always say, when it comes to Donald Trump, believe him. Okay, believe him what he said. Believe in what he says. And what does he say? Tariffs are his favorite word in the dictionary, or the most beautiful word in the dictionary, or he said both. So he believes in tariffs. He is going to use tariffs. Tariffs are not going away regardless of who is advising him. Second, go and read his America First trade policy. And this is the shift from the multipolar globalization world, or I should say, a globalized world, to a bilateral world. That's not going to change. Cambodia is going to be judged in its relationship vis-a-vis the US, not where it fits within the US relationship with China, not how Southeast Asia is so important to the United States as a counter to China. It is going to be US v Cambodia. And so that is not going to change regardless of, because everybody in that administration believes in America first, or they wouldn't have been accepted. And then what guardrails are there? And I wrote an article back right before Inauguration Day with my Clinton colleague, Thurgood Marshall Jr., and we said Trump will be the most powerful president since FDR. And the reason we said that is because he is taking all of this power through the executive branch that normally does not go to a president, other than wartime or economic disaster like Roosevelt had. And all the guardrails are gone. Congress is not a check on him whatsoever. The courts are a more limited check on him. Businesses are afraid to speak up as they had done in the past. The media is not as afraid to speak up as they had done in the past. And the one guardrail we have is the market. And the market guardrail has kicked in, but it only kicks in when it gets really severe, is when the bond market got yippy, in President Trump's words, and that's when he brings down tariffs. when China started to get when it became very clear it was going to really hit the economy, and that's when we got that agreement in Switzerland as a pause. So the market guardrail is there, but it is limited, and all the other guardrails seem to not be there. And so I think Devin is, yes, Besant and Greer are going to have some modification versus Navarro and Lutnick, but only within the context of America first in a no guardrail presidency. Lucas has a great question. I'm going to phrase it because Lucas, I'm going to phrase it to Deb, the first part. And then if you want to ask the second or third, feel free. But let me phrase your first. So Deb, this is, how do you calculate tariffs? And we'll use Lucas's hypothetical. So we've got the 10% universal baseline tariff on China. We've got the fentanyl tariff on China. Then let's say we get a Section 232 tariff on China when it comes to aluminum, meaning national security issue in the United States. So they're going to protect the aluminum industry. So they're going to put a 25% tariff on aluminum everywhere. Okay, so is the tariff coming out of China on aluminum 25%, 45%, or 55%?
Yeah, these are great questions. I mean, you'd like to think, right, that serious supply chain professionals could answer this quite quickly, but actually it's been incredibly difficult because again, the guidance has been clear. It keeps changing. It keeps being modified. And so, trying to figure out what is the tariff on, a headphone case today between market A and market B. Much harder than it should be. So any of you who are yelling at your supply chain people, it's not their fault. Okay. It's not their fault. It's not your broker's fault. It's a mess. Okay. So we have a couple of things to remember, especially if we're talking US China. Going into Trump 2, so on January 19th, there were already elevated tariffs in place. There were very high tariffs actually under Trump's first administration under Section 301, roughly a little above 20% from China to the US and roughly 20% from the US back to China as a result of Trump 1. Those are still in place. So everything still already starts from a roughly 20% tariff. Now, if you think that sounds like a low tariff, let me just say that broadly, US tariffs against the rest of the world, 2%, about 2%. And Chinese tariffs, because people seem to think that China has very high tariffs, Chinese average tariffs are under 8%. So this 20% to start is actually significantly higher than against anyone else. So we start with the Section 301 tariffs. Those still apply to all goods, or the goods that are covered. And it can be 20%, it could be 25%, some cases it's 7%. Makes it very complicated to know. You have to really look at what are you selling, what is the code for that, what is the tariff applied to that. Added on to that, especially for metal products, and I apologize since the example was metal, but metal products have often, and especially between US and China, anti-dumping and countervailing duties on them, which can make it impossible actually to sell any of those products into the US. So those also have to be added. So we start with those. We also have the original most favored nation tariff. So MFN tariffs plus any Section 301 plus any anti-dumping countervailing duty. That's where we were at heading into Trump 1 on January 20th. Since January 20th, then you add on top of that 20% fentanyl for everything. So there's an automatic 20% bump for any Chinese products into the United States. Then you reach a sort of a decision point, which is this product covered by a sector-specific tariff, like a Section 232, steel, aluminum, autos, auto parts, or is it not? If it's covered by the Section 232, then you take the 301s, the anti-dumping, the most favored nation, the 20% fentanyl, and you add, if it is one of those sector-specific products, the sector-specific product number, which currently is 25%. So that would be 20, since Trump 2, 20 plus 25, 45%, plus all that other stuff, which makes it even higher. Okay, so that's the steel and aluminum, auto parts. If it's not covered by a sector-specific tariff, then you take all that other stuff, MFN, Section 301, anti-dumping countervailing duty, 20% fentanyl, plus the reciprocal tariffs, which is currently 10%. So that's 10 plus the 20. We're up 30% for Chinese goods today for this pause. If there's an additional reciprocal tariff, it will go on top of that. So if there are additional reciprocal tariffs at the end of our 90-day pause, currently they're supposed to be 34%, that would go on top of the 20 unless they do something with 20. So this is, again, I'm sorry for the complexity, but that's where we're at. Some of these things get stacked or get added, and some of them do not. And I think that matters, especially if you're doing China-US trade. That matters less for the rest of us because the rest of Asia does not yet have this fentanyl tariff, right? So you just start with the 10%. That's new. You didn't have that prior to Trump 2. You have that 10% tariff, reciprocal tariff for everybody. And the question is, what's the additional bit that might get added when the pause stops? And again, it's important to think about this relative to others. So the question here was, do you end up with worse tariffs on Cambodia than you do on China? It may be, but the Chinese products are not tariff-free before the 30, right? So you have to, it's product by product. We would really have to compare this. The more urgent issue, I think, for Cambodia is Cambodia compared to competitors in the space, because you're not always in the same space with China, but you're often in the same space with the Vietnam, with the Bangladesh, with the Sri Lanka, particularly for textiles, footwear, apparel. And so then you want to say, is the Cambodian tariff at the moment, which is that 10%, different from anyone else? No, because you all have 10. We all have 10 right now. If the reciprocal kicks in at the levels that were originally discussed, then Cambodia is worse off than most, yes, but is not so much worse off that you would say, that's it, we're out of business now, relative to our competitors. Of course, it's still high, it's still terrible, it still should go away. But relative to your competitors, it's not as bad as it might otherwise be. So you always have to remember, compared to what? And the negotiations right now, again, is on trying to get that reciprocal rate down. That matters a lot for Cambodia because most of the things that Cambodia exports to the US would fit in a reciprocal bucket. That matters less, actually, if you're Vietnam, I think, because if you look at Vietnam's export basket, a big part of it is reciprocal, particularly, again, textiles, footwear, et cetera. But there's a large and growing share in Vietnam that is actually covered by reciprocal tariffs, especially if those tariffs hit semiconductors, and semiconductors in this case means phones, laptops, storage devices, lots of things that Vietnam actually is increasingly making, or if it hits other sectors, pharmaceutical products, et cetera, that suddenly becomes far more important, I think, for Vietnam than the reciprocal tariff does. But this is all sort of trying to explain the complexity, and I appreciate the sort of specific questions on the complexity.
And let me try, and let me give you my just maybe a way to think about this. So Section 232 is that there is a national security imperative for the United States, and that the justification for putting the 232 tariffs on steel or aluminum or auto parts or medical or wherever we end up, whatever sector they're on, is a national security one. So if that's your logic, and you'd say, okay, there's a 10% baseline tariff, and now we're going to put 25% on steel and aluminum for national security, it makes sense that it would then be 35%. It wouldn't make sense for it to be 15% on aluminum and steel and the 10% because you're trying to protect a specific sector. So we think, I think from a logical perspective, or from what Deb said, that we're going to see stacking. You put everything on top of one another. So if it's a 10% and then the fentanyl is 20% gets stacked on that, then steel and aluminum gets stacked on that. And I think that's where we're headed. But as Deb said,
we're not there now.
There's issues.
So
we're not there now.
Crucially, we're not there now on the reciprocal plus the 232s. Those are separate. So that's like, again, think of it as a decision tree. When you get to, is this product covered by a national security 232 case, it goes in one area. And if it isn't, it goes in the other bucket. Now, it could be the case that we add additional, like we add a sort of a layer underneath, or we don't worry about reciprocal tariffs. Maybe they all go away. I think it's unclear how that is. But at the moment, those things are separate. And sort of happily, again, I don't think this applies as much to Cambodia. But at the moment, weirdly, because they're getting ready for sector-specific tariffs on semiconductors, there is no tariff except for the 10% on semiconductors. So that's a bit odd as well. Like that got pulled out separately because they're waiting to do something far more painful, but they haven't yet done it. And so we'll see how long that lasts. But it is complicated to think about how this is going to be done. In the deals, because there's a ton of questions coming in on the deals that are currently being negotiated. What are you negotiating over? Again, still unclear. We have two examples so far, that what the UK got and what the Chinese have gotten, that you can use maybe as evidence. I don't know. You could make an argument they're very different from Cambodia or any place else in Asia, but I'll just tell you what they got. It appears that 10% universal tariff is going to be a 10% universal tariff with no flexibility. And I think that, again, please continue to argue vehemently that that's a terrible idea, because 10% is your whole margin of profit on a lot of companies for a lot of products. So 10% should not somehow be accepted as a floor. That's just a disaster. Don't go there. Because remember, it's 10% on top of the existing MFN, and especially for Cambodia, as it graduates from LDC status, and especially in textiles, apparel, and footwear, the MFN rates into the US are super high on textiles, apparel, and footwear. They can be 30, 40%. So 30, 40% plus an extra 10 plus a whatever, this becomes really, really difficult. And you're basically asking American consumers or American importers to pay a lot of money for products from Cambodia and everywhere else. So please remind them that 10% is a bad idea. Don't go there. One of the other things that appears to be on the table, and this is where it gets super complicated, I think, for Asian economies, is U.S. is asking its trade partners in this bilateral setting to work more closely with the U.S. vis-a-vis China. Now, what does that mean in practice? That means a couple of things. And again, it's problematic if you're in Asia. One is they do not want transshipment of goods from China to other markets to the US. That was a huge problem when the tariffs were 125 or 145%, right? Because 145% is so high that you have incredible incentives to do legal and illegal transshipment, send the package down into Cambodia and out of Cambodia into the US, stick a made in Cambodia label on it, call it good. That's a little less now that we've had this pause, this reduction and a pause. There's a little less incentive, but it's still not zero. So there will still be transshipment, illegal transshipment. You are not supposed to just take a box, stick a made in Cambodia label, send it to the US. But what you can do, this is the problem for Asia, you can, as always, import fabrics from China. You make them into garments in Cambodia. You send them to the United States under Cambodian origin. Yeah, because you transformed it. It was fabric. Now it was transformed using, again, it's complicated for textiles, and all of you who are in the space know this because of US yarn forward rules. But the point is, you can make things in Cambodia, transform them and they're Cambodian origin. What the US is also asking, and this, again, I'm telling you, is going to be rough. You have to think hard about it, to clamp down on Chinese inputs into your supply chain. And the level of that clamping down seems to vary depending on which government the US is talking to. It could be as little as 10%. 10% content can be from China. It could be a little higher for some markets for whom this is impossible. But whatever it is, it's supposed to be included in these reciprocal tariff discussions that the US is having. Now, that's complicated for many reasons, not the least of which is everybody in Asia is dependent on parts and components, raw materials out of China. That's how we built supply chains. That's how this region has grown. But also because that's not how firms keep track of their supply chains. You have not had to tell customs, where did all the inputs come from? And then pay tariffs on those inputs, right? That's new. So this is complexity on top of complexity. And so we will see where the US gets. But that's what they're asking partners to do, to clamp down on illegal transshipment, but also clamp down on the amount of Chinese content in your supply chains. And I think that is going to be really hard for Asia and for Asian governments to agree to, because they will say that's just too complicated. So what will they do instead? And there's another question here, like, well, what are you going to do if you can't go to the US? It's too expensive. What are you going to do? You're going to look for other markets. And we see that already. We see a lot of firms already who are saying, US market's been very big, very lucrative, very good for us. But if we can't sell because the tariffs are too high or the uncertainty is too high, we got to sell somewhere. We are going to increase our sales force to go out and find us markets elsewhere. Now, that is a good thing to do for lowering your own risks, but it is a problem because nobody buys things at the price points and quantities that the Americans do. So then you have to say, okay, well, if we can't sell, I don't know, baby goods into the United States, I mean, other people have babies. So it's not like there's no market for, baby clothing, but there's less of a market for baby clothing because they don't tend to buy as much baby clothing. They don't have these elaborate baby showers outside of the United States where you get, mountains of things for babies. So if that's not going to happen, then you have to think harder about, again, what is the level of global demand outside of the US for those products? And how can I be part of that? And that, again, is where we're at for most firms, the thinking through options that maybe were discarded in the past because the other markets were too small or they were too complicated or they were seen as too expensive. Now they've suddenly become attractive. So I could imagine you want to sell baby clothing. Indonesia has a lot of babies. Maybe we could sell a lot more clothing in Indonesia. Now that is not going to be the same market as the American market. It's going to be much more difficult because the logistics costs are much higher. There are Indonesian competitors who have a lot of that market. But if you can't sell to the US, you got to sell somewhere. Indonesia, making babies, we could sell clothing there. So this is the challenge that firms are having to face. Like suddenly, wow, if my most lucrative market is no longer my most lucrative market, now what?
I'll just highlight a couple points, and then I'm going to go to the last question that's in there now as a starting point for the next section. So one question is, what is the U.S. going to do vis-a-vis China? And it's, the diversification that we're seeing out of China, the China plus one, it's not just the Americans and the Japanese and the Europeans have diversified out of China. It's the Chinese who are leading the diversification out of China. They're doing it in part because that's the way things naturally happen. Japan used to dominate manufacturing in Asia, and then it got too expensive and all that manufacturing went to China. Now that manufacturing is coming into Southeast Asia. Is the United States going to look at that as Cambodian manufacturing, Malaysian manufacturing, or Chinese manufacturing? So we really need to watch that is supply chains become China plus one, tariffs become China plus one, investment restrictions become China plus one as well. And we're going to want to watch. We see the UK deal as the baseline. What else is going to come? So that's one thing you really need to be watching in Cambodia. What restrictions are the U.S. going to be putting on trading partners, changing rules of origin, or investment restrictions, or what else there might be. The second thing Deb pointed out is that, and I don't know if we'll get to this question, Devin, you had sent it ahead of time. Will ASEAN come together to negotiate against the United States? And one of the issues is if Vietnam can negotiate first with the United States and Vietnam can remove its reciprocal tariff, but Cambodia can't, then Vietnam is going to attract investment in manufacturing that would have gone to Cambodia and any other market that would have a reciprocal tariff on them if Vietnam were to lose theirs. So you're now setting up a system where the prisoner's dilemma kicks in, and countries are encouraged to negotiate with the United States first. And it will, so if everybody's at the same level of tariff, it's no big deal to Cambodia. But if you are a factory and your competitor is in a country that is going to eliminate reciprocal tariffs and yours aren't, you are going to be in a much different position. So that's something that now you need to know at the firm level. Where are your competitors? And if they're all in Cambodia, you're fine. And if they're all in Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or wherever, well, they're probably not going to get a reciprocal tariff removed anytime before you would. If they're in Vietnam, if they're in another country that is negotiating with the United States, you should be concerned. And I don't know what you can do about it, but you certainly should be concerned in watching it. And then that last question that's in the chat right now, I'll answer and then turn it over to Deb, and she can do her 6 fireflies in a jar expansion of my answer. Okay, this is a question. What is the purpose of Trump's tariffs? If the purpose of the tariffs And the purpose of these reciprocal tariffs is to get a level playing field for the United States. Then the presumption would be that the US will lower or remove those reciprocal tariffs once there is a level playing field. So how do you get a level playing field? You can do it by either you lower your tariffs, you can buy more from the United States, you could invest into the United States, you could remove your non-tariff barriers beyond just reducing your tariffs. And if you were to do that, and you said to the United States, here's all the things we're going to do, like Vietnam is saying, we're going to give, Elon Musk, hundreds of millions of dollars in a contract. Those types of things, will get those reciprocal tariffs removed. However, if your goal of the Trump administration is to bring manufacturing back home, and your theory is that the way to attract manufacturing to the US is to have high tariffs on everybody, forcing them into the US, then you'll never lower the tariffs, because you're using the tariffs as an incentive to manufacture. So I don't know how tariffs can be used for encouraging countries to reduce barriers versus using tariffs to bring manufacturing into the US out of countries, because they're contradictory purposes. So the question is, will investment move in the US in the short term or medium term? Announcements will be made moving investment to the US. There will be a lot of press releases of tens of billions, if not more, being invested into the US. Whether that actually gets invested, in part, is going, or are people watching whether the tariffs are going to stay or not. And we don't know. And that's why, with all this uncertainty and volatility in the market right now, you're not seeing a lot of real investment. You're seeing a lot of announcements in press releases, but a lot of companies are just sitting back, waiting to see what's going to happen. Now, Deb, if you want to expound on any of that.
Well, I think that you've identified some of the challenges. I would just say, I know that there is an effort by many. So first of all, on ASEAN, should ASEAN negotiate as a group? Yes, they should. I mean, that's the point of having a group, is to work together. You're not picked off one at a time, but that's not going to hold, as we already see, right? We already have ASEAN members who are deep in negotiations, and others who really haven't been asked, and others who've mostly just done a, sort of a Zoom call. So ASEAN is not actually going to act as a collective, unfortunately. And so it makes me sad, but there you go. Is it about investment? One thing I would note, again, Trump holds many inconsistent views in his head. And the quote that Steve was referring to is something that David Brooks wrote in 2017, which has become my favorite, which said that, it's interesting, this was David Brooks back in 2017. It's interesting that the entire intellectual capacity of the globe is spent trying to unravel a strategy from a guy who is basically 6 fireflies in a jar. Mm-hmm. And any one of which could be firing in a different direction at the moment in which it's firing. And you're trying to divine some kind of like master plan, 5D chess or whatever it is from this. And, now I think, oh, those are just the fireflies going in different directions. The two that are dominant for him, though, is the trade deficit in goods and invest in the US. Those are 2 fireflies that are stronger than the others. But they are also, of course, in conflict. Not in his head. In his head, I think you can do 2 things at the same time. What are not in his jar, at least I don't see them, is any focus on exports. Really never talks about exports. Isn't really interested in having US exports. Maybe at some point he'll discuss that, but for the most part, he's not interested in exports. So I would say to governments, especially, if you think that reducing your own internal barriers or your own internal tariffs is the thing that is going to attract Trump to say, I hereby let you have less reciprocal tariffs, I don't think that's going to work. I don't think that's going to work, because that's just not of interest. Trump does not want you to be exporting to outside of the US. I don't know why he's not a fan of exports, but he doesn't like them. So that doesn't strike me as the most useful thing to be talking about. Maybe you put it on the table. I don't know. I'm not certain that it makes a difference one way or the other. Purchases he loves, but there's only so much purchases that Cambodia can do of US goods that would make a difference to Trump. So, you're in a bind. I don't really know what you do here. But on the investment, we will see some firms investing. But again, I'd like you to imagine in your head, the United States manufacturing baby clothing. I cannot, other than, in niche products or some kind of, very localized production of something, it's not happening. So you could have all the talk you want about how important it is to invest in the United States. You're not making baby clothes in the US anytime soon. So then what does that mean? How do you get out of that? And I think the constant reminders, at least from a place like Cambodia, the reason we have the supply chains we have is that they make sense. They make sense. Why should the United States manufacture baby clothes? It doesn't make any sense. And this is not a national security argument. There is no national security reason why you need to have baby clothing. So we don't need to be worried about suddenly, being overwhelmed by imports of, onesies. That's just not going to happen. So I think just a constant reminder of the reality on the ground. You have Americans, they have babies, they need onesies. We supply them. You're not going to supply them. So let's not worry about that is useful. And say, if you want to make this targeted, if you want to make your tariff policy targeted, fantastic, targeted on real problems, not on whether or not we have, backpacks for children for back to school, purposes. So, thinking a bit more about what it is, particularly that Cambodia sells mostly to the United States, and pointing out that that is not a national security crisis. And that for development purposes, it's actually in the U.S. interest to continue to have Cambodia grow, to have Cambodia develop, especially if the U.S. isn't going to fund any development projects anymore. At least let's make sure that their factories stay humming. And we're not making those in the U.S., right? So there's a sort of complicated argument I think Cambodia needs to make, but keep making it because I just think discussing Cambodia's tariffs to the U.S. could be valuable. Again, if there's something in particular that matters to AmCham, then put that on the agenda. But don't make that agenda so long with non-tariff and tariff issues that you kind of miss the forest for the trees. The point here is we are not a threat to the United States. And in fact, we are an important partner on the kinds of things that the US wants. That should be recognized. And you should not hammer your developing country partners as hard as this formula did. And that's where I would, and I wouldn't get, personally, I wouldn't get too down in the weeds because this is not a crew that's interested in the weeds. Trump sure as heck isn't interested in the weeds. Why go there? Like, let's just try to keep this at a high level. These are the sort of facts of the case. Here's a one-page document. Apparently Trump loves what Indonesia did. And Indonesia literally had a sort of, one-page document. Here's 3 things we think are important. He loves it. Why? Because that's about as far as his attention goes. 3 things, 1 page, that's what you get.
All right, Devin, any questions? Anyone want to ask one live? There's some more in the chat.
I think there was a question related to, from a congressional perspective, what does it take? Yeah, well, what does it take to flip? Do you need the House to flip, the Senate to flip, the whole thing to flip? I mean, what's the?
Well, you need, the question is that the Congress is basically given its authority away to the president. That is not this president, but over time, Congress has delegated a lot of its authority over tariffs to the president. Now, there's a lawsuit going on. I don't know if Deb wants to talk a little bit about the lawsuit. So there is a legal proceeding going on because how do you say that that the flood of T-shirts coming in from Cambodia is a national security issue to the United States? And so the justification for a lot of these tariffs that are in place is under emergency powers, and that there's a national emergency in the United States. And this is never, what he is using this trade authority for has never been used in terms of national security. It's very hard to make this argument with a straight face that a lot of these tariffs are addressing a national security issue. And there is a lawsuit that's moving in the courts right now in the United States. So that's one possibility, that the courts say you can't do this for national security purposes. Now they can go back and use tariffs like they did in the first time because a country is committing unfair trade practices against the United States. And they did that to justify the Chinese tariffs back in Trump 1.0, the forced technology transfers, lack of IPR protection, the cyber theft. So there are a lot of justifications you could use for tariffs that are tailored that as opposed to what they're doing now. okay, so you've got the legal piece. Now, will Congress come back and withdraw the authority it's given the president or override his tariffs? I think the answer is going to be no, in part because the House and the Senate are so close that even if the Democrats, and right now the Republicans have shown basically no, not putting any check on the president's actions, almost none. And there are a couple of minor exceptions to the rule. That is probably, no, that is not going to change between now and regardless of who wins. And even if it were to pass, so let's say that the Democrats do way better than people expect. The Democrats flip the House, which is right now, you'd say the odds are a little bit in favor of that. Not much, but the odds are in favor the Democrats get the House. The odds right now are in favor the Republicans keep the Senate just because of the Senate map. But let's say the Senate were to flip, then the president can still veto it. And if it flips, it's going to be so close with a Democratic control, it will not be a veto-proof majority. So we can't count on we can't count on a congressional fix. We probably can't count on a judicial fix. That means it's going to be up to the business community and up to the markets. And right now, the markets have kicked in certain times, but things have to get really bad for that to happen. And the business community has, for the most part, not been as vociferous as it should be in such a harmful situation.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I would say, where is the business community how is the business reaction changing? There is a slow growing movement, which I expect will accelerate on small businesses in the US, because a lot of small businesses import products from overseas to sell, especially retail sales, to sell in their own either online shops or physical shops, or they rely on imported parts, components, et cetera, to make the thing that they'll ultimately sell. So think about, I don't know, someone who's knitting and selling blankets online, right? So that's someone who relies on imports of yarn in order to be able to sell their products domestically. They have been badly harmed by this, and they are starting to mobilize. It's not necessarily going to change Trump's mind. He certainly doesn't care about small businesses at all. But there are people in Congress who do, because that's hitting small players across different constituencies. And so maybe Congress starts to mobilize on this, but it would take quite a lot, actually. But what might make a difference, which we should keep an eye on, is other kinds of governmental retaliation. And one that we see in particular is the European Union is incensed about this entire effort by the Trump administration. And they're particularly mad because on Reciprocal Tariffs Day, they got 20% reciprocal tariffs handed to them. And the EU has been so far very adamant that they will not accept a 10% baseline tariff. That is not going to happen. And in fact, the EU now has a retaliatory list of tariffs that runs to, the last time I saw it, 218 pages worth of things that they intend to retaliate against. It is very carefully crafted by the European Union. They have 20,000 staff members who are focused on this, just in the EU, plus all the member states. So what they've done is they've gone through the electoral map and they've said, where are the vulnerable Congress people? Let's target our retaliation in those areas on those products such that they have to do something, right? So it's Kentucky bourbon and whiskey. It's Harley Davidson motorcycles once again. Poor Harley, they get it every single time. It's certain kinds of, wine companies. It's certain kinds of agricultural producers. The purpose of that is to try to galvanize Congress to do something, so that they feel it personally when they go out, try to do a town hall, they're overwhelmed by, unhappy farmers, they do something. That's been a playbook. That's how we actually handle trade retaliation in the global system and have done that for decades. It used to work very well. It is less clear whether that is going to make a difference under this Trump administration. They're just not, Congress isn't really intervening in trade. They might do so, but they're also, the White House isn't that interested in what Congress seems to be up to. So it's an interesting game that we're playing here. It could be the case that Congress gets more involved than they were. And we'll have to see what that looks like. And that's why this retaliation in particular is one to watch.
Yeah, and then I'll just, in terms of the question on the naval base and the scam centers. I mean, I think the answer is yes, that they do care, but that's not related to trade. And I don't think, I think that's, again, the trade focus is very much on the bilateral trading relationship and the bilateral deficit between the US and China. I think where AmCham Cambodia could make a difference, I'm not would, but maybe could make a difference, is what are the non-tariff barriers that Cambodia could be addressing? Because it's not going to be doing, Cambodia is not going to invest in the US to the amount that will move the needle, I wouldn't imagine. And it's not going to be purchasing the Boeings that we see coming out of the Middle East on Trump's trip or the British trip. But is it, you know, in relating to the online scam centers, but those non-tariff barriers, I mean, intellectual property right protection, counterfeiting. I'm not sure how much digital of the issues are in terms of digital trade and data localization would be, you know, and corruption. Those in non-tariff barriers are of importance to USTR. And to the trade negotiations. And I think focusing on, they're important. Now, whether they move the needle is a different question, but they're non-tariff, they're in the national trade estimate. I'd certainly go back and look at the national trade estimate, see where Cambodia is listed. But those things, if that's the things you could bring to the table that may be able to move the needle in that America First bilateral trade agenda. But there's not a lot.
Before we run out of time, let me just address something that I think is super important that came in on this question that Lucas just wrote, which is really worth paying attention to, right? If you can't go to the United States, if you can't or won't go to the United States with your exports of goods, trade in goods, we're not talking, again, services not counted, et cetera, trade in goods, you have to go somewhere. And so one thing that I think is going to be a real issue that Cambodia will have to brace for, and that firms operating in Cambodia and elsewhere will have to brace for, is if you're not going to have those extremely competitive manufactured products going to the US, US is a very difficult market. So if you can crack the US market, you're good. You're very good at whatever it is you make. At the high end, at the low end, it's irrelevant. The point is, if you can crack the US market, you're very competitive. If you can't go to the US, though, you're going to pivot. When you pivot, you are also going to create additional competitive pressures in domestic markets that didn't face them in the past. And so I would say for firms on this call who are very competitive, clearly, again, cracking the US market, fantastic, you may find a lot more competition both within Cambodia, maybe that's less of a concern for you, but within third markets, right? Not US, maybe in Europe. The ferocity of the competition in Europe for those consumers is going to escalate, because it will not just be Cambodian firms making baby clothing who are trying to pivot to a shrinking baby market actually in Europe, but ignore that for the moment. The point is, you're going to pivot. You're going to go to the European market. They buy a lot of stuff, not as much as the Americans, but they do buy a lot of stuff, and they buy it at good price points. So you're going to pivot, but you're not the only ones who are going to pivot. You're going to find textile producers out of Vietnam who are doing this, and out of Bangladesh who are doing this, and out of Sri Lanka who are doing this. And when they all pivot to Europe, it will be harder in Europe for Cambodia-based firms to be successful. I think that's also something that is going to be challenging to try to figure out how to make that work, either in Europe or in, you know, the Middle East or wherever it is that you decide to go. Those competitive challenges are going to be coming at you in places that you may not, in ways that you may not have experienced before. I think, again, slightly good news in my view for Cambodia specifically is that I don't think, given your export basket and export profile at the moment, you will be head to head with Chinese producers in the same way that some other firms will be, because you're not necessarily competing with China. China has moved on to different things. But if you're in a different market segment, right, if you're making, I don't know, headphone cases or something, like that's where you could really face new competition in third parties by Chinese competitors who used to go to the US, now not. And, you know, it's going to get brutal. It's going to get brutal. And so I just want to highlight that, you know, these firms, hyper-competitive firms going into the US will be hyper-competitive in whatever market they happen to be in. And so that is a new challenge that we need to face. And one other thing, while I'm thinking about it again, as we come to a sort of conclusion, that I want to put on the table, and this one is awkward, which is maybe why I can say it and maybe other people cannot say it. But, I think it's going to get very hard to be an American company actually operating and to be attached to an American company and an American brand in a lot of places, because the pushback against Americans broadly is going to be large and continuing. And so I think we should remember, and again, it's difficult, but we should remember that some of the advantages that American companies and multinationals have had for our lifetimes are really rapidly eroding. And so that is going to be also very unsettling for firms and for individuals, because you're just not going to have the same gravitas when you march in the room, and you're not going to have the backing necessarily of the U.S. Embassy. They might even not even have a U.S. Embassy at the rate the State Department is getting cut. So you're just not going to have the sort of privilege that American companies have had. And I think we should just be at least make a mental note like that. Think about what that means for you, for your company, et cetera, if that happens. And I think it is, and it's happening in time, speed that we couldn't have imagined.
And I'll try and close on a slightly positive note. It's going to be difficult. And Deb just previewed an op-ed I've got coming out in the Nikkei on the 21st. I think it's going to run, which I quote Deb in it, and you just heard Deb's quote that I put into my op-ed. So if you want to follow me on LinkedIn, I'll post it and a lot of other stuff when it comes out. But that is a challenge that we're going to have. And it kind of, though, to Lucas's last point, is what is going, what's the Chinese reaction going to be? So let's say we don't have this grand bargain. Let's say we end up with move to strategic decoupling. Then you are going to get you could get hit. You and Cambodia could get hit with the U.S. and its reciprocal tariffs, and also the China +1 tariffs. But China's going to need to be looking for new markets. So it's not just, Deb said, well, all these businesses in Cambodia need to look for new markets. Chinese companies are going to need to look for new markets, and they may also need to look for manufacturing. And so you may get a flood of Chinese goods into Cambodia, and you may get a flood of Chinese investment into Cambodia. And so what is that going to do with regards to China's reaction to Trump's reaction to China's reaction? So that's something that you got to watch. And the positive note, I'll close and turn it over to Devin, is that, and this is why AmCham Cambodia has never been more important. You need to have a place to try and follow all of these things that are going on. Deb and I don't sleep anymore, basically, and other people in our field don't sleep. And AmCham Cambodia doesn't sleep because what's happening everywhere in the world is now impacting you, especially Washington, Beijing. But what is Vietnam negotiating with the United States? What's the Chinese reaction going to be? Is ASEAN going to connect with the EU? Will CPTPP grow, which could be worse off for Cambodia because you've got Malaysia and Vietnam in CPTPP and you're not. All of these things happening, there's just no more important time to be an AmCham Cambodia member. And Devin, you can always reach out to me and Deb, and certainly, work through the American Association of the Indo-Pacific and anything else we can do, because we just need to learn from one another. And this has been very valuable both to Deb and I to see the types of questions that we're getting. So thanks for having us.
Well, thank you, Steve. Thank you, Deb. Thank you both for coming. Again, setting the table today, very insightful as far as what's happening regionally, what we're all kind of dealing with and trying to understand in the world. For all our members, thank you for joining. You make the chamber what it is. If you're not a member joining today, feel free to please consider. I know Steve and Deborah are both on LinkedIn. I connected to you both, follow you both. That's where I get a lot of good information as well. And consider looking at AAIP as well as Hinrich Foundation. There's plenty of insights coming out from you guys. And
if you want to see your picture, and if you want to see your picture on LinkedIn, turn your camera on. We'll do a big group photo. So if you want to be on, we'll take a group photo, and Noemi from APAC Advisors works with me. She'll she'll help do a good summary of an overall summary of what we talked about. She's great at that stuff. All right, I see 12 of us. Anybody else? Oh, there we go. 13, 14. Wow. All right. I'm just reading the comments. Let's see what's the thank you. Good luck and thank you for sharing, and wait, I got it right. And God bless all of you and have good luck and a good day. Yes, we all need that good luck to have a good day. So that is a perfect way to sign off. All right, Noemi, you want to take the picture? Give us a count it out to 3.
Oh wait, I'm on my phone, so maybe it's best if someone
Oh, you're
else
gonna make me do it.
Yeah.
All right, I'll
Sorry.
do it. All right, here we go. Go on. All right. Oh, we got one more person. Here we go. All right, everyone, count it. Look in the camera. Oh, back to 12. All right, 1, 2, 3. Oh wait, we got 2 more people. I'll do it again. Hold on. Oh wait, we got more people. All right, here we go. If everyone wants to look in the camera, 1, 2, 3. All right, I got it.
Very nice.
All right. Thank you, Devin. Thanks for doing this with me, Deb. Thanks, Noemi.
Yep.
Thanks,
Thank
Devin,
you.
to your team.
AmCham team, nice job. Thank you. Yep.
Yes,
Have a
great
good day.
job.
Bye.
Bye-bye.